welcome to another earth-shaking, record-breaking, and burger-embracing episode of What Happened, the show that chronicles video games, movies, and media with disastrous development cycles. So, let's get started! Most should be familiar with Monolith Soft, the Washington State studio responsible for such classics as Blood, Septerracore, and the Fear franchise, among many others. Established in... God damn it! Tokyo-based developer responsible for Xenosaga, Batten Kaitos, and those Project X Namco games that everybody wants, but nobody actually plays. Now, while Monolith Soft started working almost exclusively under Namco, that relationship gradually dissolved after the retirement of then Namco CEO Masaya Nakamura in 2002. This was due to the eternal structure of the mega publisher changing drastically once it merged with another company to become the mighty Bando Namkai that we all know today. Conversely, Monolith CEO Hirohide Sugiura felt that after the merger, they were getting less and less flexibility to create what they wanted, so they broke away from Namco in search of better opportunities. They then struck up a relationship with Nintendo's Shinji Hatano, who promised more creative freedom in their games as long as they were exclusive to Nintendo hardware. After that, it wasn't long before they were tasked with making something very different and very quickly for Nintendo's then newest hardware, the Wii, or as it was known back then, the Revolution. Now, look, before we go any further, I have to address the fire tornado in the room. There's probably a sizable percentage of you out there that might not have even heard of today's game, and there's a good reason for that. So, if you are a disaster day of crisis virgin, then let's take a moment to catch you up. Raymond Bryce is a former U.S. Marine and international rescue team member who gets caught in the middle of a paramilitary force named Surge from occupying Blue Ridge City. They're demanding a ransom from the US government, and if their demands are not met, then they'll unleash a man-made earthquake that'll set off a chain reaction of every disaster movie cliche you can think of. Along the way, Ray will save dozens of people, shoot dozens of people, and eat an entire watermelon in one go. As to how this crazy adventure came all about, well, I'll let the game's producer, Hitoshi Yamagami, set the stage. Approximately 1 year before the release of the Wii, around the beginning of 2006, my boss Sugiura said, "Let's do something big and epic for the release of the Wii." Up until then, Monolith Soft had worked mainly on RPGs, but is also very good at video production, so I decided to work on something that makes good use of that. As a result, the project turned into an American movie-like action game dealing with natural disasters. When this idea started to come together, I realized that it would be interesting. However, the content was so rich that I wondered if it could really be done in just 9 months. But the team said that it could, so we started development. However, by the end, it turned out that the development itself was a disaster. So yeah, the only mandate from the higher-ups was to make something epic for Nintendo's new console, but they only had 9 months in which to do so, as the Wii was releasing that November. While the studio's pedigree laid in RPGs, they had the foresight to realize something of that scale couldn't be done in such a time frame, so they decided an action game would be a safer bet. But just a simple shoot-bang wouldn't be epic enough, so like Yamagami said, natural disasters were thrown in, as a little treat. Problems started to happen almost immediately.
Oh, this definitely has turned out to be one hell of a day.
The main one being that Monolith Soft did not receive Wii development kits right away. They did have an idea of the final specs, but they had to start designing the game with their old GameCube kits. Now, this wasn't seen as a problem at first because they were pretty familiar with the old lunchbox, as they were just finishing up Batten Kaitos Origins at the same time. So they simply plugged away like this for a few months, but when they did receive the final Wii hardware, they realized several aspects of the game just wouldn't work. They had designed this early version of Disaster with standard controls in mind, and thus classic controller support was what the game primarily used, having no idea just how integral the Wii Remote would be to the Wii experience. Amongst the team, it didn't take long for concerns to start arising that Day of Crisis, despite having some exciting ideas, wasn't all that thrilling or unique to actually play. Since a good chunk of the game revolved around saving people from perilous situations and tending to their wounds, but with that initial reliance on standard controls, all you had to do was press the A button and bam, you were a hero. Many on the dev team felt that this wasn't particularly fun or inventive, and since it was a core concept of the game, these concerns were very valid. This got to such a point that in October of 2006, just a month before the Wii was scheduled to hit stores, that the team were still struggling, so it was decided by Yamagami and his bosses to shelve the game temporarily because there was no way it was going to make launch. This is actually a refreshing change of pace when compared to most stories we cover here at What Happened, because many games are simply visited by the good old captain in order to get them over that finish line, which, as we know, rarely ever works in the short or the long run for that matter. This was, though, an especially tough time for the team, as their first big game under a new partnership with Nintendo was clearly not going well, and they would miss the lucrative launch period. It could have been worse, though, because Disaster narrowly avoided being cancelled altogether.
Damn it!
Yamagami recalls this pivotal point in the game's lifecycle. I considered canceling the development, but I thought that would be a waste because of the theme, and the cinematic style presentation was very interesting. Although it would cost a lot of money, I thought it could result in a unique game, so I set a new timetable and discussed how to steadily solve the problems one by one. After a while, we had a proper development system in place. So, with a new plan and refocusing on the control possibilities of the Wii Remote, the team expanded the game in a lot of key ways. While you could navigate environments and rescue people like the original builds, combat would be handled completely differently, becoming an on-rails shooter whenever encounters with Surge broke out. One thing you can certainly say about the Wii Remote is that it made this type of gameplay immediately accessible, and what's more is that it wasn't some basic implementation of it either. With the new release date being shifted to 2008, it allowed Monolith to really flesh this out. You could acquire multiple weapons with different firing speeds, crit chances, and ammo capacities. You could even unlock crazier special weapons and level each gun as you play through the story, leading to a pretty robust system when compared to other light gun fare. Driving sections were also added, which saw Ray Ray and his chin strap either dodging cars, collapsing buildings, or even volcanic rocks being spewed into the sky, because that's how disastrous this game gets in a single day.
This man will be in danger if he stays with me.
Now, since these vehicle bits used motion controls exclusively and was one of the last things they implemented, a few of the staff felt they were a bit too difficult, as just one or two mistakes could force the player to start over. Having experienced them a few times myself, I tend to politely agree. Now, the man orchestrating all of this disaster, Keiichi Ono, had up until then only directed in-game cutscenes for Xenosaga and Baten Kaitos, and found himself in the big chair for the first time. He was the one that came up with the idea of an action game revolving around a famous WWF tag team, and he also found the game's development a bit taxing to him personally. Monolith Soft has made many RPGs, so it was a challenging project in terms of general know-how. The procedure for making a game, how to put everything together, becomes RPG-like itself if you approach it a certain way. There was definitely a learning period to make that method suitable for action games, so that's where I struggled initially. In the end, I cleared each problem while learning how to make everything work. As the release date approached, the team was keen to include all the features the Wii could provide, and delivered something that was unlike any other game Nintendo had published yet on the console. It launched in September of 2008 in Japan and was published by Nintendo themselves, and while it shared a lot of similarities with the Disaster Report series, its focus on action, cinema-style presentation, and a strong main hero set it apart. That also reflected in the review scores that it garnered, which were all above average or even better for the most part. However, the crisis was not yet over for Raymond Bryce. In fact, his most perilous journey had barely even started.
A tsunami. A big one's coming.
While quick video snippets of Disaster were seen in several Nintendo presentations and social media accounts throughout 2006 and started again in 2008, it began to no-show in a lot of Nintendo of America's release lists and PR, which led many to speculate that it might not make the trip across the pond. That's because just 2 years into the Wii's life, fans were starting to get used to the fact that not all games announced by Nintendo of Japan would see release outside of Japan. The first real hint that Disaster's chances of making it over were slim was with an IGN podcast where Matt Casamassina paraphrased a conversation he had with then NOA president Reggie Fils-Aimé. We hung out with Reggie, and basically, he doesn't think Disaster is a $50 game, especially in terms of audio, which he said is laughable. He's going to wait to watch and see how it performs in Europe. If it does well, you'll probably get it in America, and if it's a bomb, you probably won't. This news, as you can imagine, made the rounds, as websites love to point out the many games that Nintendo of America would skip. Of course, amplified by Project Rainwater. What was it called? Operation Rainfall. God, that takes me back. Now, talking brass tacks here, it's true that certain specific games made for the Japanese market might not appeal elsewhere, but like Disaster Day of Crisis was literally modeled after American films, so it couldn't have been more appropriate. The prevailing theory is that much like the legendary Metal Wolf Chaos's original release in 2004, was that PR people would sometimes worry that American sensibilities and cliches captured through a Japanese lens still might not translate well. Like, wait, what are you talking about?
I'll smash it faster than a Florida recount.
Regardless, this is going to be a sticking point with Disaster from here on out. The script and the voice acting.
Tough guys like you were such fun. It'll be so much more satisfying when I destroy you. Now then, shall we dance?
NOA were not down with it. Honestly, it doesn't even matter the reason why. Just know that they weren't having it. I mean, personally, I can't imagine it any other way.
They kidnapped her.
Which is also a sentiment shared by the actual people behind the dub and the motion capture. Most might know Ruben Langdon from
This party's getting crazy. Let's rock.
And
This could be interesting.
Bring it on, meatball.
But aside from just voice acting, Mr. Langdon has an extensive history working in Japan on Sentai action series, stunt work, and has done motion capture for major Hollywood films and about every AAA game series you can think of. The company he co-founded, Just Cause Productions, were then hired to bring that cinematic flair to the cutscenes that Monolith Soft were looking for. He expressed his disappointment regarding the lack of news for a North American release, and even confirmed that the game's audio and script were a point of contention. Still not sure if we will ever see this game stateside. After we finished the mocap and voiceover stuff, Nintendo of America decided that the dialogue would not fly with American audiences. The original cast was brought in to re-record a lot of their lines. Probably the most noticeable change was changing
Storm.
to
Surge.
A lot of the other changes were pretty minor, just changing sentence structure and other stupid stuff. Not quite sure why they did it, the original sounded fine to me. Last I heard, there were actually going to be 2 versions of the game. I think the Japanese release stuck with the original version, the one that we, Just Cause, created together with Monolith. Not sure about the European version, whether they went with the original or the Nintendo of America rewrite. Anyway, I do hope it does make it to the shelves, whichever version they decide to go with. Like I said, a lot of hard work went into making it. I just don't want it to go to waste, damn it! To clarify, the re-recorded dialogue was in the European and Australian versions, which released shortly after the game's Japanese debut. Furthermore, Reggie himself did confirm in an investor meeting that NOA was indeed going to be gauging the game's EU sales and then make a decision based on that.
Don't tell me.
Okay, it's a bit tricky to actually make a good guess of overall European numbers, as each country reports them all separately and inconsistently, so we're gonna have to rely on the UK charts. Yeah, it's not great. During the entirety of Disaster's debut month, October 2008, well, it simply failed to crack the top 50, meaning it didn't even chart, so things were fast becoming, Japanese numbers honestly weren't much better. It moved somewhere in the neighborhood of 21,000 copies before dropping off the charts there as well. As to why, well, you can certainly make the argument that action games like this weren't exactly what the Wii was all about, but it's also a fact that Nintendo of any part of the world marketed the game rather poorly. There were minimal print, TV, and online ads for it, which of course was certainly a factor as to why it didn't make any tidal waves at retail. If you're among the many that hasn't played it, what you'll find is a fantastically cheesy, charming adventure that constantly throws new stuff your way in terms of gameplay, all to the bombastic orchestral score by Yoshihiro Ike. Story-wise, it's a cross between Metal Gear Solid and the aforementioned Metal Wolf Chaos, just with a lot of American disaster movie tropes mixed in.
Because every disaster is like a gift from God!
It's certainly rough in a few areas, I can tell you that for free, with graphics being a bit worse than what you'd see from the higher-end Wii games of the day. Certain missions, as discussed before, do feel a bit unbalanced. Again, something that I speak from experience, since I own both versions of it. Fortunately though, while the game was far from a success, it didn't spell desert for Monolith Soft as a studio. In fact, they started doing better than ever. Nintendo bought a majority stake in the company in mid-2007, which then resulted in the eventual release of Xenoblade Chronicles for the Wii. Given the studio's sterling RPG pedigree, it was indeed a pretty big hit that in turn led to Nintendo entrusting Monolith and supporting them on other big franchises like Smash Bros., Zelda, and Animal Crossing. So fortunately, not a sad end at all, just a tad disappointing. If Nintendo wanted to mitigate risks, Disaster could have seen a digital release on the Wii U, or hell, even the Switch itself, as most of its motion-centric sections would have played just fine. Keiichi Ono, for his part, left Monolith in 2012, but he was still credited as a combat designer on Xenoblade Chronicles X when that was released a few years later. So while its sales were dismal and Nintendo may have been right to not bother bringing the game to North America, no, fuck, they were wrong. I mean, they brought out goddamn Devil's Third in North America, and that's way worse, so yeah, I don't have a point here. Just the next time you see Raymond Bryce in Spirits Mode, just remember to thank him for saving the world during the course of that fateful day. If you know of any other cataclysmic video game or movie developments, let me know in the comments below, flail your arms as you run towards my Twitter, or wade through the waters of the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big burly boss to nominate the subject of a future episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.
I don't want it to end yet!
You sick bastard!